We're going to 18-inch wheels next year as well, another big change, particularly I guess at the front. But my question to you is, if there were no changes at all and we were carrying on with this car, but going to 18-inch wheels, would that increase the problem, or would that decrease the problem? What effect does the 18-inch have at the front in terms of airflow and wash?
Well, potentially the 18-inch wheel, particularly with the wheel fairings, should really improve things, because what you don't have is this big balloon tyre moving around in the airflow, getting in the way of the front wing end plate, spilling off lots of turbulence. So the smaller profile of the tyre and the larger flat surface inside and outside of the wheel, which would be covered with brake ducts and wheel fairings, would actually already make a big improvement.
But they're not narrower though, are they?
No, they're the same. It's effectively the wheel is slightly taller, effectively bigger in diameter, same width. You just have an 18-inch wheel rather than these tiny 13-inch wheels.
Yeah. But are you imagining the actual carcass will be stiffer?
It will have to be, because you can't have that small amount of tyre moving so much. So you're going to have much more of the suspension of the car managed by what we regard as the suspension. So there'd be much less of the movement. At the moment it's about 50-50 between the tyre and the wishbones and the springs and the dampers and all the clever stuff inside the car. Now it's going to be much more focused from 2022 onwards into what sits inside that nose cone. But, and it's a big but for the teams, they've had a lot of their complicated systems inside the suspension banned. So we can't have inerters, which controls an element of the acceleration of the wheel tyre assembly going up and down. They can't have some of these clever remote hydraulic systems, which have got a big level of hysteresis built in order to allow you to play about with the ride height at different speeds. So it's going to be a much more, I dare to say, almost conventional spring damper setup inside the nose of the car and inside the tail of the car, which will really restrict the teams in how they can play about with the tyres and play about with the attitude of the car as it goes around the lap under braking, acceleration and particularly at high speed.
But will there be any more compliance in the suspension? Will the car actually have any more vertical movement?
The car will have significantly more suspension movement. Because you don't have the movement coming from the tyre now. The tyre, will probably produce only about 20% of this entire movement of the wheel and tyre in comparison to the sprung part of the chassis.
So you can design in anti-dive geometry,
yes,
for example?
You can still go back to some of the old geometrical things, but you can't have some of the clever hydraulics and the clever valving systems which teams have been running, and that's much more restricted. Albeit some of the regulations are a little bit woolly, and it would be very, it'd be hard for the FA to prove how much, one-way travel you can have in terms of damping and spring control and some of these things.
And while we're on the front, S-ducts?
Still legal, a little bit trickier now. The thing that probably will go will be the cape, because when we look at all of the bodywork on the car now, it's taking something they used back originally in 2009, where they're applying tangential rules to the cross-section and concave and convex minimum diameters. So you can't have lots of holes and sharp surfaces in the way that you've had before. So at the moment, if you look at the main side pod of the current cars, they're quite smooth, quite homogeneous, and it's quite an attractive look. That will now be applied to the rest of the car. So all of these kind of sticky up bits, sharp edges, fins and veins will not quite be banned, but a lot of that will be taken away, and it's going to be hard to get things like the cape underneath the nose to be put back in. Now you could actually argue that the way the aerodynamics under the car now works is the cape may not be as useful as it has been under the current regulations, but all the same, it's a surface that teams will always want to try and play with if they have it. That's really not going to be there in the same way as it has been now.
Okay, so to sum up on the front of the car, if we go from the tip of the nose, say back to the dash, if at the moment, and I'm just plucking these numbers out of the sky, but let's say the regulations define that part of the car and an Adrian Newey has maybe, I don't know, let's say a 30% chance, 70% is given by the rule book, but he's got 30% to play with. Would that be on the current car? Would that be somewhere?
I mean, that's as a figure picked out of the air. That's probably not too bad. At the front of the car, there's not a lot you can do.
What I'm saying now, on the 22 car,
yes,
it would be only 10% left to play with. Would that be right?
Yes, so I mean it's much more restricted. At the moment you've got a lot of freedom and you've got a lot of areas you can play with prescribed components and the volumes you've got to put things in. Really all you're talking about is some of the wing profiles and how you shape the nose. Now the launch cars that we saw all had very big fat noses. That isn't part of the regulations. The regulations are actually very similar to what you have now with those little kind of thumb tip noses or the Mercedes Slim nose. So teams can still play about with that area. It just won't be quite as powerful as it has been because all the barge board area is gone. What it will be important for is getting airflow under that front wing and hitting these underfloor tunnels to create the downforce.
Okay, let's talk about cockpit backwards, kind of, as well as the sides. We've got one car which stands out from the rest, which is the Alpine at the moment. Are Alpine still going to be able to do something very different in that area, the way they are at the moment?
In terms of side pods and cooling and that kind of top body and the roll hoop inlet, that's all very open. Again, we saw lots of very stylized looks on the FIA renderings and the show cars. That's not part of the rules. You've got very similar volumes in which to work in. Again, you've got that kind of rounding and tangential regulations to be fitted. There are some opportunities here because the way the regulations are working is back in 2009, all cooling openings in the main part of the side pods were banned. And if you can remember before that, we had people like Renault that had almost a completely louvered side pod. There is a louvered section allowed in the side pod. Now this was used in a very simple way on the show cars where you just had a couple of rectangular louvered sections towards the back end of the side pod. Now I can imagine someone from a team, you know, the kind of the newie, someone with a big idea, really kind of shaking things up to really exploit those areas and effectively get rid of almost the Coke bottle exit of the car, and most of the hot air will exit through these louvered sections if that works for them. So that's going to be an area that's going to play about with a lot, and that would work both with the Alpine system and a more conventional radiator layout.
And you've used this phrase, if that works for them, quite a few times. This is to the backdrop, of course, of the budget cap to the next tier. It's even less, which impinges on R&D budgets. So in theory, there's less scope, apart from the fact that the rule book is changing, there's less scope anyway to be looking for the solutions.
There is much less scope. The teams couldn't start really working on the aero design until the beginning of this year as part of the restrictions that came in as part of the pandemic. And what you're going to find is that some teams will pick on a good idea really early, and you would hope that a lesser funded team finds the right idea straight away. And there's always that hope that someone will have a great idea and you'll get a kind of a Tyrrell moment where they'll just find something that really beats everybody else.
Or a Ross Brawn moment.
Or a Ross Brawn moment, exactly. But equally,
I wonder who he's going to pass his ideas on to.
The trick for the teams is to try and get as many ideas through CFD and the wind tunnel and pick out the ones that have got the most potential. And that's, despite the wind tunnel and CFD restrictions, despite the budgetary restrictions, it tends to be the better funded teams which already have the systems in place to filter out ideas really quickly and throw lots of ideas into the wind tunnel. And unfortunately that tends to mean is the teams that are currently at the front will probably remain at the front, and even if someone had a kind of a Brawn-esque moment, those teams are going to be the ones best placed to kind of look at it, take inspiration from it and potentially implement it on their cars. So, you know, there is a chance for a bit of a shake-up here, but I don't think we're going to see a massive change to the order.
Okay, rear wing and everything that's going on with the diffuser, let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, the key thing in these entire regulations is really the diffuser, and we can't really call it a diffuser anymore because it's gone much more back to a wing car, as we used to call it. So what you currently have is very much a flat floor under the car and then a small diffuser. What you're going to have with the new regulations is a big converging inlet to get lots of air into the underfloor, a small, not quite flat but curved middle section, and a much larger diffuser, which means much more of the downforce will be produced by the underneath of the car. Now that will be helped partly by the rear wing, which we'll talk about in a moment, and equally by the front wing, which has been kind of raised up, and the nose has been raised up to get lots of air under the car. Now the theory being is the underfloor is much less sensitive to the wake of another car, which is again the key reason for these regulations. The downforce it produces is much more central in the car, so you don't get that balance shift. You will get a downforce reduction, I mean that's unavoidable. Someone in front of you has taken all the energy out of the air already, but it should affect you slightly less and you'll get much less of the understeer that the drivers currently get, and get now much more neutral, if less performance set of aero from the underbody tunnels. Now you don't have skirts, and again a lot of people call this ground effect, which is kind of technically correct, but you could equally apply that to the current things. I think when we use the term ground effects, we're just recalling those skirted cars of the late 70s, early 80s. Skirts haven't been implemented. The problem with skirts is they create huge amounts of downforce by sealing the underbody, but when they break contact with the ground, the air rushes in, you lose all your downforce. So you have basically a kind of a current floor on steroids with the 2022 regulations, which has been very clever. And as the air comes out of the diffuser and you're trying to expand it, you then now have a much more powerful rear wing in an odd kind of way, because the beam wing, that lower wing either side of the exhaust, has come back right above the diffuser exit, and you still have quite a large and quite a powerful rear wing. And that's going to be important, because the whole concept of the airflow coming up behind this car isn't to kind of blow it out sideways, it's to kind of pick it up and throw it upwards in a very narrow way, which means the car behind works in much clearer air. And that is really the exact reason that they've gone for this kind of shape and design. The cars will have less drag, and if they can create enough downforce from the underbody, they can downsize the rear wing, which would improve their air efficiency, and means they can get faster or run more downforce.